Welcome. We're here today with Professor James Kurth, uh, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Swarthmore College, and also the author of The American Way of Empire, which was published a couple of years ago. Um, and we have some other videos talking about that on this YouTube channel. And today we're very lucky to have him because he's going to be talking a little bit about the death of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who by chance was also a teacher of Professor Kurth when he was a graduate student at Harvard. And then we'll also talk about how his worldview relates to Professor Kurth's own model, the seven-stage model of strategic crisis to catastrophe, and then put that in the context for current events. And with that, I turn it over to Professor Kurth. Please tell us about your relationship over the years with the late Henry Kissinger.
Well, my relationship with Henry Kissinger began more than 60 years ago, 61 years ago. I had been an undergraduate at Stanford University, and in my generation, every young man had to serve his military obligation. So after I graduated from Stanford, I spent 2.5 years on the 7th Fleet flagship, patrolling the coast of the Chi-Coms, communist China, as we called it. And then when I came back, I decided to go to graduate school at Harvard. I thought would be the place to go. It seemed to have a lot of people who were associated with the Kennedy administration. Obviously, you learned a lot, and then you might be able to act a lot. Action intellectuals, they were called in those days, and I wanted to become an action intellectual. And so the very, very first class that I walked into as a graduate student in September 1962, we did not know that within a month there'd be the Cuban Missile Crisis. The very first class that I walked into was a defense policy seminar. Defense policy seminar. Now, the seminar had actually 70 people in it, graduate students, but it was led by Henry Kissinger, already well known to be an advisor to the Kennedy administration, already the publisher on 2 books on nuclear weapons and foreign policy. And in those days, he advocated using nuclear weapons to advance foreign policy. Anyway, so I had a long defense policy seminar with him during the fall of 1962, including his take on the Cuban Missile Crisis as it was unfolding before our very eyes. Later, I took a course from him on international politics. So I suppose I was dyed deep in Henry Kissinger. I didn't choose him as my thesis advisor. Everybody said he was very arrogant, and he had much to be arrogant about, but that if you wanted to get an appointment with him sometime in the spring to discuss your work for him, you'd have to make the appointment in the autumn because he was so important and so busy advising people in Washington. Advising students, even PhD students, was not very important to him. Well, of course, as things unfolded, I stayed at Harvard in the 60s. He stayed at Harvard in the 60s until, of course, he was tapped by Richard Nixon in the fall of 1968 after Nixon was elected president, and on the advice of Nelson Rockefeller, who was a great patron of Kissinger, on the advice, and with Nelson Rockefeller giving advice, people took the advice. Henry Kissinger was appointed National Security Advisor, and he never came back to Harvard. He always looked at the state at Harvard because Harvard, as the Vietnam War got deeper and darker, especially under Kissinger, Harvard was the stain upon him. Years later, when there was something being set up called the Nixon Institute, they convened a bunch of foreign policy people. Henry Kissinger was one. He gave an address. I was one. I gave an address. Most important was the banquet address, a black tie dinner. And the person who addressed the banquet was President Clinton at the time. And so as I was sitting there at the table, Henry Kissinger came up. Hadn't seen him since he'd gone off to Washington in 1969. Henry Kissinger came up and said to me in front of course, the other people around the table, how much he had liked my presentation. And I thought that was very nice. Of course, it was especially nice to have all those other people hear it. And I said to him, oh, well, Professor Kissinger, I suspect you don't remember me, but I was a student at yours at Harvard. And he said, oh, Harvard, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. They don't know anything. And so that was, and of course, by that time, I thought he was right. People at Harvard didn't really know anything. And so that was the last I saw of Henry Kissinger. But in the time since then, I found it amazing. As he aged, he got wiser and wiser. And I became to like him more and more when he was actually making foreign policy on Vietnam and on Cambodia and on Chile and on East Timor. All of this from 69 to 75, 76. But it was actually making foreign policy. I loathed him. I thought that he was a combination of a war criminal and a cynic too clever by half. Well, as soon as he got out of being in office and actually being able to affect policy and could only give advice, most of the times it was not taken, well, then he aged and got wiser very quickly. And so I'm a great admirer of Henry Kissinger, more or less in the second half of his life. The first half, he spent a lot of it taking the lives of other people. But in the second half, he got serious and tried to figure out ways that maybe with all the terrible things that had to be managed, rising powers, rising nuclear powers, growing threat of a nuclear confrontation or so, and most recently, the threat of artificial intelligence, he became a wise man. And I thought most of the things that he wrote and said were very wise. And indeed, I'm such an enthusiast of him in the second half of his life that I have right before me, 3 books. Here's one that he recently wrote on world order. Now, I don't think there's any other book on world order that's more orderly and a way to approach the world than that book. Then, of course, he's famous for his diplomacy. That's the way you manage relationships with great powers, adversaries, as well as allies. And here is his magnificent book on diplomacy. This is, in other words, the objective is world order, diplomacy, not sending in military forces again and again and again and forever wars. Diplomacy is the way to deal with other powers, even adversary powers. And by the way, the most important of the adversary powers is, of course, China. And here's his book on China. Now, mostly this book is about himself. But he does understand China as nearly as important as himself. And so there's a good deal about China that goes all the way back to the formation of China under the Qin emperor, who was so important in Chinese history that the country took his name. And that was that's almost 2,500 years ago. So you see, there was a time that I loathed Henry Kissinger. Now, more recently, I can't say I've loved him, but I've liked him. And so I would say that, yes, I regret his passing, but after all, 100 years, he saw a lot, he affected a lot, and he taught a lot, and I was one of his students.
All right, well, thank you for that. I'm wondering, now that you've given us the background, if you could talk a little bit about your own theory of the 7-stage model to strategic crisis and catastrophe, and if any of Kissinger's teaching affected your abilities to make models.
Well, I believe that 2020 was a very decisive year in the history of international politics and a lot of politics. Including American domestic politics. 2020 will be looked back upon by historians, if there are historians in generations to come, as a kind of watershed year. It began, of course, with the coronavirus challenge, what I call the medical crisis, Now, at the time, it was already clear, even at the time of the US government and other governments shutting down their economies, lockdowns, it was already clear that the medical crisis was serious enough, but the response to it by political leaders in government shutting down economy would produce an economic crisis. That would be the second crisis. It wouldn't replace the medical crisis, but it would come on top of it, sort of like successive layers, geological layers. So the economic crisis would consist of people being thrown out of work because of the shutdown of the economy. But then I thought it was very likely that governments would respond by printing money to give to these people out of work. And then that would create not just a kind of recession type crisis, but an inflation type crisis, something like the stagflation of the 1970s. And so I figured there would be probably by the late spring or early summer of 2022, there would be a full-blown economic crisis. But that in turn would begin to issue in a political crisis because there's so many people whipsawed between unemployment and inflation, then that's going to create a lot of political discontent. Now, even before 2020 started, everybody knew 2020 was going to be a year of great political discontent. There was President Trump, who would get the nomination for the Republican Party, but then there were going to be the Democrats who loathed him, supported by the administrative state that loathed him, and by the elites in the media and academia, and even in corporate business. And so it was going to be a very tense political year, even looking forward from 2019. Well, given the medical crisis and the economic crisis, that just charged it. And sure enough, there was a political crisis. Now, I did not predict it would take the form of the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis, detonating a long, hot summer, mostly peaceful, as the media always said, mostly peaceful riots and demonstrations and burning and looting. I did not predict that, but of course that aggravated the political crisis. And then in the run-up to the election, things got very charged. The election then became contested, as we know, and then it concluded at the beginning of 2021 with the famous, notorious January 6th. Now, I had predicted a political crisis, but nothing that multidimensional, nothing that explosive. However, I figured that even back in the spring of 2020, that when the political crisis came along, and it eventually came along, as I said, much more intense than I'd expected, that then that would open the door to the strategic crisis, Now, notice everything I've said thus far is largely domestic, although, of course, the virus was a pandemic affecting other countries, and the economic crisis was also involving other countries, disruption of trade. But most of what I've been talking about could be centered on the United States. But the strategic crisis, and this is what Henry Kissinger himself understood, and what I learned from him 50 years, 60 years before, what happens is that when you have a number of contending powers in the international system, especially one that is the leading power, the hegemonic power that has set up the world order when it was even more powerful than it was in the present time, then there would be a number of powers who had been put into the margin, sort of put on the periphery of the big action of international politics by the leading power, often much thought of itself as a unipolar power. But these other powers were natural adversaries of, let's say, the United States, but that they had been marginalized. But now the United States, and this happened in the past also, for example, in Britain in the run-up to 1914, the United States was having a lot of domestic polarization. It was weakening. It couldn't concentrate. And when that phenomenon happens in international politics, great domestic division and disunion, that's when the adversary powers see their opportunity to make a move to help revise, that's why they're called revisionist powers, revise the international system to gain some of what they had lost under the hegemony of the great power. And there happened to be, for the last a decade or more, there have been 4 revisionist powers. 3 of them already nuclear, one of them, Iran, soon to be nuclear. And each of these powers considered themselves an adversary of the United States. The United States, in each case, had prevented them from expanding their influence, or rather, kind of regaining their influence in regions that they had been much more powerful in the past. And so they would be looking for an auspicious moment, as the Chinese say, when the adversary is divided, and the political crisis would cause the division, as well as the earlier economic crisis. And they would be looking at the international system to make a move when the great power was kind of polarized, maybe even paralyzed. So I anticipated that as we entered into 2021, either a renewed Trump administration, but even less legitimate as a result of the polarization of the election, or a new Democratic administration, that they would then be testing that either the Trump administration or the Democratic administration. I thought that would be happening, and when Biden was nominated, and when he was elected, then of course he symbolized himself in his very being, his mind and his body. He symbolized paralysis, weakness. It was almost, he was a caricature of a kind of weakened United States. And so it was pretty clear to me that there would be a strategic crisis beginning sometime in 2021, 2022. Historically, even when the United States was the leading, almost the only superpower, every time there was a new administration, the adversary of the day, normally the Soviet Union, tested that new administration in the first year or year and a half to sort of see, could they get their act together? Did they have the skill, and behind that, the will to continue to resist or contain the Soviet Union? So they tested that. That notoriously happened with John F. Kennedy in 1961. And what happened with Biden in 2021 or 2022? Now, of the four revisionist powers, and in order of size and power, the largest China, and then Russia, then Iran, and then, yes, North Korea. As small as North Korea is, they have a very big nuclear weapons deterrent and indeed offensive capability now. So they would all be looking for opportunities. Now, each of them would like the other to make the first move. So the United States could focus on them, and then that make the moment even more auspicious for the remaining revisionist power or powers to make their move. So each of them would be looking at what the other was doing and the way the Americans were reacting, but they would want to have the other go first. And even better, maybe have two, number one go and number two go, and then maybe they'll make a move. I figured that the people who would be most patient, and this has been true for 2,000 years of their foreign policy, would be the Chinese. They would wait for one or more of the other powers to make the move. Everybody knew, that say of the revisionist powers, that the Russians historically were always the most impetuous, most likely to move quickly and move crudely compared to the others. And sure enough, that happened with the Ukraine crisis, commencing at the very end of 2021 with diplomatic exchanges that, of course, never went anywhere, and then the actual outbreak of the war in February and March of 2022. So the Russians made a move. And of course, the United States got very focused and distracted on that. So it was obvious the Iranians would make a move. And sure enough, they have. Now, the Iranian way of foreign policy, and this has been true even since Iran and its predecessor, Persia, this has been true for 2,500 years. The Iranian or Persian way of foreign policy is similar to the ways of foreign policy of other great land powers that had, at one point or another in their history, great land empires on their periphery. But all powers use, of course, actually strong armies, strong navies. All powers use strong economy, but they also use diplomacy and different kinds of diplomacy. Amongst the tactics and techniques that imperial powers use and have used for millennia, if they've been around that long, amongst those are the use of proxies. And another is the use of deception. Now, all of them use proxies and deception, but the masters of all the historical great powers, and certainly the ones today, the masters of the use of proxies are the Persians, now the Iranians, and the masters of the use of deception are that. Now, the Iranians, that is, say, the Islamic Republic of Iran, they are the masters of the use of proxies amongst all the contending powers today. They have an array of proxies, half a dozen proxies. All but one, Hamas, are Shiites, forming a Shiite crescent that stretches from Tehran on the Iranian high plateau to the west through Mesopotamia, otherwise called Iraq and Syria. The Tigris and Euphrates are the two rivers that run through Iraq and Syria, and that Mesopotamia means the land between the two rivers. And then moving beyond that, all the way to Lebanon, but moving to the south, all the way to Yemen, and a Shiite or Shiite-like minority in Lebanon called the Houthis. So what you get by now, and this is already in place by beginning as by 2020, what you get is you have three proxies that are now almost encircling Israel. To the south is Hamas and in Gaza. That's the one proxy that is not Shiite, but Sunni. But they are perfectly willing to work with Iran and vice versa. To the north, you have a much more formidable group even than Hamas, and that's Hezbollah, a Shiite militant force in South Lebanon. In the center, in the West Bank, you have another proxy. You have another proxy of Iran, and that is called so-called Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Together, these form the southern front for Israel, the northern front, and the central front. And over the last half decade or more, Iran has constructed a noose of these three proxies around the neck of Israel. The only proxy, the only area that they don't have a noose, of course, is the Western Front, and that's the Mediterranean. And so they use those proxies to put pressure on Israel. And of course, they certainly used Hamas to put terrible pressure on Israel on October 7th. It was predictable, but the Iranians had disarmed kind of mentally and morally the Israelis by their deception. It's a very elaborate discussion here, a whole theory, but there was this so-called, very much well known in Israel, this so-called conceptia. The Netanyahu government had a conception, it was joined by the IDF, that Hamas was broken into militants and moderates, and that if the Israelis dealt kind of somewhat gently with the moderates and provided economic incentives, they would be able to take over from the more militants in Hamas. This was all a deception. This meant the Israelis had let their guard down and did not have an adequate surveillance and reconnaissance of what Hamas was doing as it was building to launch the terrible atrocities and assaults of October 7th. But this was all very much of the Iranian way of doing things. The Iranians taught their proxy how to use deception. And then they coordinated them with what they call the axis of resistance. That's their other proxies, all united against Israel, especially the ones on the central front, the West Bank, and the one on the northern front, there's a Hezbollah in South Lebanon. And so all of that's been unfolding, but at the core of it is Iran. The ultimate decisions and the resources, the training, the particular techniques and tactics, all are Iranian and follow the Iranian way of war and earlier the Persian way of war. So all of this was predictable in the minds of someone who might think like Henry Kissinger, realizing that international politics always was a struggle between competing powers to advance their national interests, maybe being deterred or paused by strength of an adversary, taking advantage of weakness. All of this is very much the Kissinger way of thinking, and he saw that the kind of calling of a true statesman was, given this reality of always struggle and competition, how can you through diplomacy bring about world order, at least world order in the sense that you don't have world war? Remember, Henry Kissinger, as a young man, grew up in the run-up to World War II in Germany, and then in World War II was in the US Army, and then when the war was over, in Germany again. He knew how terrible a world war could be. In some ways, he dedicated his life to preventing another world war. And as in the last few years, he was especially concerned that the US was moving towards first a Pacific War and then a world war with China. But he also knew you could get into a world war through the back door, just like in World War I, the great powers of Europe got into a war through the back door of the Balkans, what was called the Near East then. And that's how we could get into a world war today, through the back door of the Levant and the Middle East today.
All right. Well, thank you for that sobering analysis. You've gone through 4 steps of your 7-stage model. What are the last 3 steps?
Well, it is a case, I believe, of going from crisis, like the medical crisis, to crises, such as the medical and the economic and the political and strategic, to eventually to catastrophe. There will come a time, and Henry Kissinger was especially concerned about this, where the strategic crisis and with the various adversaries, the revisionist powers, pushing here and pushing there, there will come a time when US military forces will be directly involved in actual combat, perhaps with a proxy being backed by a major power, or with the major power itself. And given the technology of today, high-tech technology, missiles, drones, cyber war, and the weaponry of today, with the US focusing on its legacy weapons, high-tech versions of the weapons that won World War II, like the aircraft carrier, like the bomber, like the tank, or more recently, from the Cold War, the long-range missiles. The weaponry of today that the United States has, high-tech versions of the weaponry of half a century or more ago, it's very vulnerable to the very high-tech weaponry of our time, as I said, drones and very accurate missiles and cyber war. If we get into armed combat with one of the revisionist countries, most obviously China, but also the others, in the first week or two of the war, there will be thousands of American military lives lost. Be most dramatic if we try to use carriers to defend Taiwan. 2 or 3 carriers would go up in smoke from the Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles. That would be a great shock to the Americans. Now, when that happened in 1941, despite the earlier divisions, everyone united. But despite the divisions there, America is far more divided today on many different dimensions. And if thousands die in some remote place to defend Taiwan, or perhaps to defend Israel, or perhaps to somehow protect Ukraine, this will be very divisive. And so that's going to give rise, and of course, the military now, having been highly wokeified, if you will, it's no longer got the combat capability that it had in the Cold War, or certainly World War II. And so that means there would be a crisis of credibility of the US military. That would begin, and there are plenty of demonstrations, just like the demonstrations going on today over a different issue, but one that could ultimately issue in this, the demonstrations between pro-Palestinians and pro-Israelis today in America. That would therefore issue in what's the next crisis after the strategic crisis. The strategic crisis is the external threat to security. The next crisis is a security crisis, the internal threat, kind of demonstrations, riots, burning, that sort of thing. Sort of, you might say, the summer of 2020 on steroids, because it's now reinforced by the military crisis that had occurred before. It's a breakdown of law and order. Now, we already have in the large cities of America, compared to what it was in 2019, we already have a breakdown in law and order. Most of these cities, of course, are ruled by progressive governments. They, in turn, are part of a long pattern of democratic rule. These are one-party states. They don't have to really worry about being turned out of office. And essentially, for ideological reasons, certain economic and social reasons, they're donors. The mayors and the town councils, city councils of the large cities, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. These cities are essentially being turned over to anarchy, be it the homeless, or be it criminals, or homeless becoming criminals. And therefore, middle-class people, businesses are fleeing. But what is left is therefore an electorate that will continue to vote, because they're playing the racial card, continue to vote these incompetent, or worse, destructive progressive governments in these cities. So we're already having in our cities a breakdown of law and order. That's one of the great bastions of progressive government, the great cities of America. That's already a foretelling of the kind of a security crisis. Another place where it's breaking down seems so different from that. But what's the other great bastion of progressive ways of doing things? The universities. Just look at what's happened to the universities now since October 7th. Large numbers of people, Jewish students, feel deeply threatened, and rightly so. They're not paranoid. And then look at the administrations, the progressive administrations, how they deal with this disruption, increasingly violence, people being beaten up students being beaten up on campuses. They're acting like the progressive mayors. So in these two great arenas where progressives already rule, you have a breakdown of law and order, everybody feeling insecure. So that is the security crisis. It will spread if there is a catastrophe militarily overseas, with thousands or tens of thousands of American soldiers killed within a week or two. Well, when you have the breakdown of security, then everybody, the most important thing, breakdown of law and order, I need protection. And everybody begins to flee into little groups of people that can protect them. They first begin by buying more and more weapons themselves. Then they join groups of people who will unite together when the police will never be there when they're needed. And so then you begin to have the security crisis becoming a societal crisis. The society is beginning to break apart. People are desperately breaking into little tribes that can protect themselves outside the official law and order people because they're not providing law and order. So that becomes the societal crisis. In other words, the society breaks down into tribes, groups of people led by warlords, the toughest guy on the block, but they can protect their followers. This is essentially the anarchy of what happens, as Hobbes said, when the authority breaks down. Life becomes poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So that's the sixth crisis. And at the end of that is the seventh, the total catastrophe, the new dark age.
Well, I would say thank you for that analysis, but it's a little depressing. Is there any way you see of avoiding the new dark age?
Well, at each point, as you move from one crisis to another, the decision makers have had and have today and will continue to have choices. In other words, going back to the medical crisis, there was one path to lock the economy down, which they did, and that aggravated the medical crisis and produced the economic crisis. But there was another path recommended. Of course, it was marginalized, and that was not to lock the economy down, but to focus on the vulnerable. The young were not really vulnerable to COVID. There were a few cases, pre-existing heart conditions in young people, but for the most part, the most vulnerable people were like me, older people, or those who had various immunity deficient diseases and things like that. You could have focused on protecting them and kept the economy functioning. So there was a fork in the road. Now I can walk you through each of the successive crises as the United States and their European counterparts or allies, or what I often call their dominions in the American empire, as the governments moved to the new crises, there was always a fork in the road. They could have taken an off-ramp from the road to continuing and accentuating crises. They could have taken an off-ramp that would have then stopped the movement from one crisis to another. Again and again, the elites of the Western countries, especially the United States, took the path that therefore would produce the next crisis and would aggravate the crisis they were already in. So there's always an off-ramp, but they haven't taken it. So I'm not confident when the next crises come up and there's some off-ramp, and I could identify what they are, but they take the wrong path. Now, an excellent example of that right now is the strategic crisis. That is that it was quite clear that within 2 or 3 months of the beginning of the Ukraine war, by May of 2022, it was quite clear that the way things were working, you would eventually have Russia and Ukraine settle into a war of attrition. The people who are military specialists in the Russian way of war, and also in the Ukrainian way of countering the Russian way of war, and in the dynamics of the technology of the various of the two countries and the aid behind them, the US in the case of Ukraine, they understood that despite all of the talk about an offensive here, an offensive there, it would eventually come a war of attrition. And as early as May of 2022, Henry Kissinger put forward a proposal. He put it forward before Davos, the World Economic Forum. And that was a proposal to have negotiations that led to a ceasefire, an armistice on the field, the line of battle at that time. And in the end, that it would be sort of analogous to what happened in Korea in 1953. And there would be a kind of demilitarized zone set up, but Ukraine would essentially lose control over Crimea, which they had lost before in 2014, and of the Eastern Oblast that had in the past had been Russian populated, Russian speaking. They would lose that, but then the rest would be preserved and would be more unified and more robust than the Ukraine before. He proposed that then. He proposed it again a year later in the spring of 2023. Of course, the Biden administration and the foreign policy elite of this country, including many Republicans, no, they kept pushing for the spring offensive of Ukraine. That would take back the territory. Well, the spring offensive didn't happen this spring, then it started in the summer, and it sputtered out because anybody could see that the Russians had used the preceding winter, following the Russian way of war, to build a top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art defensive echelon. And so now we're getting that stalemate. Now, the Biden administration is desperate to bring this war to some kind of conclusion, a frozen conflict, if you will, as we enter 2024. They don't want the Ukrainian war and all those expenditures hanging over them as they enter into the 2024 election. So now, behind the scenes, they're pressuring the Ukrainians to settle along these lines. And the way they're doing it is withholding weapons from the Ukrainians. Similarly, the other major NATO power most supportive of them, or at least they said that, and providing weapons are the Germans. They have the same calculation. So what the Biden administration, after a year and a half, are settling down to what Henry Kissinger advocated a year and a half ago, and then half a year ago. But between now and then, tens of thousands of people have died. Young Ukrainian soldiers, an entire generation has been decimated, more than decimated. That's more than 10% have been died or maimed. The generation of Ukrainians between age 18 and age 30 have been completely devastated and depleted. They're no longer there to fight any kind of renewed large-scale war. And the similar thing has happened to the Russians, all for nothing. And of course, it's weakened the United States too, because it's increased polarization here. And the whole Ukrainian aid is a giant issue in Congress and the wider public. And then, of course, not surprisingly, since this distraction, if you will, has been going on, then the Iranians saw they could make the move. And that's what they did. And so now we're going to have other divisions coming up in terms of what could happen in Gaza and Israel in terms of a way out. There are, in a very dismal situation, there are certain ways in which the conflict could be contained and human lives could be saved, and Hamas would cease to exist or would be deterred, or there are various ways. But the Biden administration, they're not interested in that. No. Here's a proposal. Secretary of State Blinken issued this about 2 weeks ago, what I call the 4 thou shalt nots. He, like Moses, gave 4 shall nots to the Israeli or Israelite people. And here are the 4 shall nots. Thou shalt not kill any civilians in Gaza. Oh, you can take out Hamas, but you can't kill civilians. Too many have been killed already. Well, that is true. But the idea that you can surgically extract Hamas from the population is delusional. They know it's a lie. The second thing is, thou shalt not have any military occupation of Gaza. The third is, thou shalt not change the geographical boundaries of Gaza. And the fourth is, there will be no expulsion of the population from Gaza. This means they're saying, recreate Gaza so it looks exactly the way it did on October 6th and all the time before. which means it's only a matter of time until Iran pours in resources and doesn't rebuild Gaza. No, it rebuilds Hamas. And then using tunnel warfare, that vast array of tunnels underneath the surface of Gaza, underground Gaza as opposed to above ground Gaza, little Gaza rather than big Gaza, the Iranians taught them a distinctive way of war, tunnel warfare, which in turn they had learned from the North Koreans, who are the masters of tunnel warfare. And a crucial part of tunnel warfare, this is what the North Koreans do, this is what the Iranians are doing with their nuclear weapons program. The crucial thing is you put everything that is crucial underground, deep underground. And then very quickly, you can bring it above ground and fire. In other words, like missiles. Those tunnels underneath Gaza are vast missile storage areas. And then the Hamas people there can pop up out of the tunnel, set up a missile, fire it into Israel, and that's the way it's done. Now, of course, they can fire missiles from buildings above ground, but as long as there's tunnels under there, they will be automatically a vast reservoir of ways you can fire on Israel, either sending out militants like they did, on the ground on October 7th, or missiles, or both. And so, essentially, the United States is taking a path that guarantees more conflict, more the U.S. being divided because of this, and weakening the U.S. And so you see again and again the policymakers thinking like the elite, with their fantasies about the way the world works, very different than Henry Kissinger's realities of the way the world works. Their fantasies make all things worse.
Well, another grim analysis. I guess to wrap this up, we talked a lot about Ukraine and Israel, Gaza. What about Asia, Africa, Latin America? What's happening there? Is there any significance to the election of this libertarian in Argentina? What does the future mean for Japan and Taiwan and so forth and so on? I mean, just give us a little tour of the world in relation to your theory and current events.
Well, since the major, biggest, most threatening revisionist powers in China, and that, of course, is in East Asia, rapidly expanding to incorporate all of Eurasia, since that's there, they're watching everything and making sure they benefit from it. And of course, from their point of view, if the United States is conflicting with Russia in Eastern and Southern Europe, what's there not to like? That is to say, if the Russians win, the Russians win, the Americans are weakened. If the Americans win, then that means the Russians are weakened. That makes them more dependent upon the Chinese. And therefore that expands Chinese power further west into Eurasia, because then Russia is reduced to the level of one of those Central Asian republics. So what's there not to like? And if it goes on to be a stalemate and they keep bleeding each other white, that's even better. So that's the way the Chinese think about the Ukrainian conflict. Now, and what's going on now, they'll be perfectly happy to have Iran and the United States, continuing squabbling, fighting. That would distract the United States too. So this means it makes it easier for them to make a move on Taiwan if and when they want to do it. They're looking at everything that is happening in terms of, first, the big picture, the Henry Kissinger world order and the relationship between the powers. They're looking at it that way, and this is weakening the United States on many dimensions, including internally. But they're also looking at it as an analogy of how they can deal with Taiwan. in other words, taking it over some way. Do not think, however, that they are reduced to only taking it over the old-fashioned way of a direct amphibious landing. No, since October 7th, they've increased their military exercises around Taiwan, and even before that, they were increasing them, and they're all designed to be able to put a blockade around Taiwan. Taiwan imports virtually all of its food, virtually all of its fuel, and its export, of course, of these wonderful semiconductors from the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. Well, if you blockade it, then Taiwan will just kind of wither away, freeze to death in the dark. And what's the United States going to do to break that? Send the carriers, they'll be blown to bits. Send the bombers, they'll be blowing up too. And so this is what's on the potential agenda. However, it doesn't mean that the Chinese are even going to make a move on a blockade. Napoleon said, never interrupt an adversary when he's making a mistake. The United States is making mistakes in two different places. Why interrupt them by, instead of an auspicious moment to take advantage of them, this is an auspicious moment to have the United States take disadvantage of itself. Now that's East Asia. Now turning to Latin America. Well, ever since 1898, maybe since 1823 in the Monroe Doctrine, but ever since 1898, with William McKinley entering the Spanish-American War and Teddy Roosevelt being a Rough Rider and all of that, well, it's all been assumed that Latin America is essentially an American sphere of influence, and especially the Caribbean and Central America. When I wrote my book on the American Way of Empire, that was the prototype of what would become a global American empire. Latin America, from 1898 to, let's say, 1945, that was the prototype. Then we recapitulated that on a grander scale in Western Europe and in East Asia during the Cold War. Well, what is the condition of Latin America today? Well, Cuba has been an adversary, a thorn in the flesh of the United States, obviously, since 1959, 1960. Venezuela, whose government is propped up by Cuban security forces, highly specialized security forces, that is essentially a kind of colony, if you will, of the Cuban Empire. But in any event, that's completely anti-American. Nicaragua is part of this kind of Marxist axis of resistance, if you will. These are the big three consciously anti-American, and America can't do anything about it. Then you have a series of actual Marxists, in a couple cases, ex-guerrilla administrations in other parts of Latin America. The president of Colombia is a former Marxist guerrilla. Then you also have similar governments in Peru and some chaos, drug lords, cartels contending with radicals, etc. in Ecuador and in Bolivia. The entire Andean region is essentially becoming a cross between Marxism on the one hand and chaos on the other. There's a left-wing government in Chile. There was a left-wing government in Argentina, but this person now is completely opposite, but he has no following. There's no party that can support him in the Argentine Congress. He is a libertarian, but he's had no experience in governing, and therefore you're going to get kind of dysfunction and anarchy in Argentina, which of course is nothing new, since that's been going on ever since the Perones. So I've always been crying for Argentina, despite Evita saying, don't cry for Argentina. But I'll tell you one thing, Evita, you and Juan made such a mess that there's a lot to cry about for every decade since. So that's that. Africa? Well, uh, one coup after another by anti-French and then more broadly anti-Western and therefore anti-American military insurgent group led by some disgruntled colonel. That's been happening in several of the Sahelian region countries, such as Niger and Mali and so forth. So the truth of the matter is the U.S. is, as Richard Nixon said at the time of Cambodia, he didn't want the United States to be a pitiful, helpless giant. Well, actually, between him and Kissinger, it didn't really end up as a pitiful, helpless giant. Well, now more and more it seems that way.
Well, that's also a very grim analysis. I'm just looking for something hopeful to end on as a optimistic note. If there is any cause for optimism in your analysis.
Well, I happen to be a person of faith, which means I take the Bible very seriously. And the Bible teaches that all empires rise, they reach a zenith, then they fall, they decline and they fall. God superintends the rise and fall of empires, of nations. And I think that's happening. We simply happen to be at the end of the life cycle of the American empire, or more broadly, the American Republic, constitutional republic. That doesn't function much anymore. And more broadly, Western civilization. Virtually everybody in the West, in the universities, and in the media loathe Western civilization. So we're at the end of a life cycle of American empire, more broadly, the American constitutional republic, more broadly, Western civilization. But in other dark people of faith who came together and put things back together again. And I expect that will happen too.
So basically, you're saying that people will become more religious and religious communities will save civilization as they did in the first dark age. The new dark age
save it by preserving the best, discarding what had become toxic, and step by step, gradually, they will build a new civilization that will contain the best parts of the old, but will have new parts to fit the new challenges.
All right. Well, that's at least something that we can look forward to. It's a ray of hope through the darkness. I want to thank you for this analysis, and I just want to hold up your book one more time, The American Way of Empire by James Kurth. That book was a couple of years ago, and it just talks about America. Could you tell us right now, you're working on a bigger sort of history of civilizations, am I right?
Yes, I'm engaged in a project on comparing civilizations. Civilizations such as the Western civilization, the Chinese civilization, the Islamic civilization, and these are contemporary, but there were also predecessors of that going all the way back to 2,500 years ago. There was, of course, the classical Mediterranean civilization of the Greeks and Romans that was eventually, after a dark age, succeeded by the Western civilization. There was, prior to Islam, there was the civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, such as the Sumer and Assyria, Babylon, the Persians. So it's a comparison, and the Chinese civilization, actually longer in time even than 2,500 years ago, it unified as China, and then eventually under the Han Dynasty, the Han people within nation state of China. All of that goes back millennia. And so it's a comparison and contrast of the rise and fall of civilizations. What are the off-ramps in the course of the life cycle that preserves the civilization for yet another season, for an Indian summer, maybe a couple Indian summers? That's what I'm interested in now. I'm hoping our civilization doesn't collapse before I complete the project.
Right. Well, we'll all hope for that as well. I want to thank you for a most insightful and provocative and very relevant discussion of global affairs today. And I think is a tribute to Henry Kissinger. I know you were a student of Samuel Huntington, but I do think he must have had some influence on you because of the global panorama that we saw. And I want to thank you again, and I hope we get to talk about another topic sometime soon. But for tonight, I want to thank Professor James Kurth, and we'll see you again in our next interview.